Vladimir Putin gave a 45-minute speech at Valdai in 2022 and then gave a 4-hour question and answer session, or 3.75 hour question and answer session, all without a break. If nothing else, you have to admire the stamina and the intellectual flexibility. Now, if you're curious about how Vladimir Putin engaged with the rest of the world in this 4-hour Q&A session, but don't have 4 hours to watch it all, this is the video for you to watch. I'm Jeff Rich. This is the Burning Archive, and here I talk about geopolitics, history and culture, the books that I'm reading, the books that I'm writing, and the ways in which I'm trying to make sense of the emerging multipolar world around us. And this is the third video I've made about Vladimir Putin's plenary session at the Valdai conference in October 2022. And this one is covering the amazing 4-hour Q&A session that he had after giving his quite significant speech about the Symphony of Civilizations. You can check out my outline of his speech and my discussion of some of the cultural references you may not pick up at first blush listening to his speech in the links below. Now, in the previous videos I went into some depth about the speech, explaining its argument and its references, but here in this video I'm going to give you a speed read of this amazing session to give you a sense of who is taking the opportunity for dialogue with Putin and the breadth of the issues discussed. It is quite entertaining and there are some light moments, but it does require 4 hours of viewing. So here we go. So first of all, the host, Fyodor Lukyanov, asked Vladimir Putin 9 questions, largely about Ukraine. And then we have questions from 24 individuals from 17 countries, like Russia, South Africa, Armenia, Sri Lanka, the Kyrgyz, the Republic, China, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, Moldova, Indonesia, India, Brazil, Pakistan, South Korea, Belarus, South Africa again, Greece, Canada, Hungary, Venezuela. Only 5 questions from Russian citizens. It's an extraordinary breadth of perspective about the issues of concern to people in dialogue with Russia. And along the way, the host, Fyodor Lukyanov, throws in a few questions as well. And these questions are not just from journalists, but from academics or public intellectuals of various kinds, diplomats, former diplomats, military figures or former military figures, business figures, and so on. It's really quite an impressive intellectual dialogue, really, of some interest. And I'm going to give you a rapid-fire rundown of these questions now, so you can follow up the most interesting ones either via video or via the full transcript of the session that is available on the Kremlin website. Okay, so this will be a little bit of a test of my summarizing skills, but let's see how we go. Okay, so as I said, first of all, there's a sort of a dialogue session with the host, Fyodor Lukyanov, in which he asks 9 questions. So first of all, he asks, in a revolutionary situation, Vladimir Putin, do you associate with the top revolution from above or the bottom revolution from below? And Putin says definitely from with the bottom. His mother was a mere worker. And globally, Lukyanov asks, what about globally? Well, Putin says, I stand for democracy for all, not just the golden billion. What's changed last year? The main point Putin responds is new centres of power are emerging around the world. And what's changed in the Russian state? The main thing Putin says is, we were concerned, and this is a quote, we were concerned about becoming some kind of semi-colony reliant on Western partners, but have been resilient and realised our capabilities and our spirit as a country. And most of all, this motto, here we quote, we leave no one behind, actually sits deep in the heart of every Russian and in the other ethnic groups who are Russian citizens, and the willingness to fight for our own people solidifies society. This has always been the great strength of our country. Then Lukyanov asks about what happened before the decision to invade Ukraine or to establish the special military operation. NATO ignored Russian security concerns. We were told to shove it, to be quiet. Kiev refused to implement Minsk agreements, and there was shelling in Donbass for 8 years. Question 6. Did you underestimate the enemy? There is a feeling about that in our society. Putin says no, but we were aware that there was a long-term process of fortification going on in the Donbass, and it could get worse. You might want to follow up various of the channels that discuss the military situation in Ukraine to understand that reference a little bit better. Question 7 from Lukyanov. Ukraine and Russia, are they one people? And here Putin outlines his account of the history of the Russian world that he's articulated at length in various places, and the process of divisive nationalism that has emerged, especially from the 19th century, and the role of Ukrainian Nazi collaborators and extreme anti-Jewish activities in Ukraine as well. And he refers to quite a long-standing attempt by European countries, and here I'll quote, they tried and partially succeeded in creating a barrier between Europe and the Russian Empire using the principle known since the ancient times, divide and conquer, perhaps a reference to our good old friends, the English Empire. They started making attempts to divide the united Russian nation. It began in the 19th century and eventually grew to a bigger scale, supported mainly by the West. Of course, they tried to cultivate certain sentiments in people, and some people even liked it when it comes to historical and language aspects. Question 8, are we in a sort of kind of civil war? Putin says partly yes, and it refers again to the strange processes of the creation of a Ukrainian state by Lenin and Stalin, and I guess also by Khrushchev. And then cheekily, Lukyanov asks, so what is the plan for the special military operation? And disappointingly, perhaps Putin doesn't reveal the plan, but does say that the most important thing is to help the people of Donbass and to ensure that both Lugansk and Donetsk are fully liberated. So that's just the first session with Lukyanov, who's like a significant Russian intellectual journalist, academic type figure, the sort of figurehead of the Valdai discussion club. Then we go into the questions from the audience. who are people invited by the Valdai Discussion Club, who are allowed to come from their states. And the first question is from Ivan Safranchuk, who's from Russian MGIMO University. He's an international relations academic. And he asked, is it true that the world is on the brink of nuclear war? And how would Russia respond in these circumstances? Putin's response is that it's always a risk, but the West is heating up the rhetoric on nuclear war to divide the rest of the world from Russia diplomatically. He refers to Prime Minister Truss's comments and also the actions of the Ukrainian government in terms of shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and comments that the United States is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons militarily and did so without a clear, justifiable purpose. And then he refers, of course, to Russia's military doctrine, which outlines the circumstances in which it would use nuclear weapons to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and safety of the Russian people. But he also comments that he is ready for dialogue with the US on strategic stability, noting that Russia is perhaps more advanced than America in the use of hypersonic weapons. The next question is from Rasigan Maharajh, who heads up a economic think tank in South Africa. And his question is, what could constitute a more democratic and workable alternative to the current international system of payments and settlements? Putin comments this is a crucial point, that he's actually hit the bullseye in terms of strategic questions. And he notes that the United States has made a mistake by weaponizing and politicizing the financial system. What we need are more effective international institutions of finance that support education and technology transfer. And the main way to proceed is to, and here I'm quoting, to create a supranational global monetary system that would be depoliticized and based on national currency systems. This system would certainly ensure payments and transactions. There's going to be an enormous amount of action on this issue over the next couple of years. Third question is from Alexander Iskandaryan from Armenia, and he is a political scientist, heads up the Caucasus Institute, and has looked at various ethno-political conflicts in that area. He asks, how does Russia plan to respond to the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation and act in the future in this context? Putin outlines the Russian process for settling this dispute without dictating to anyone, and comments that the dialogue with Armenia proposing to settle the Nagorno-Karabakh matter, comments that there has been a dialogue with Armenia proposing to settle the Nagorno-Karabakh matter, which is the sort of region control of which is in dispute. Armenia de facto controlled 7 areas in Azerbaijan, and we suggested moving towards normalizing relations. There are 2 areas, Kalbajar, and another one further to the south with corridors, large areas. So Russia's actively involved in organising a peace settlement there, and there have been some suggestions that the United States has been actively involved in creating trouble in that region. Then Lukyanov pops in with a question about Erdogan, President Recep Erdogan of Turkey, and he is asked what kind of leader is Erdogan, and Putin comments that the most important thing is he is a consistent and reliable partner. He's also clearly played a key role in negotiating the sort of grain arrangements to enable export of grain from Ukrainian ports. Then we have a question from Diane Jayatileka, former ambassador of Sri Lanka to the Russian Federation. And he asks a complex sort of question to Putin about commenting that Russia is experienced the greatest threat to its security since 1941, when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa to invade Russia. And he asks, would Putin embrace parts of the communist heritage of Russia, including the history of the Red Army, in order to join in a broad patriotic front in the way that at that time Stalin reached out to the Orthodox Church? It's a complicated question, but Putin's answer is interesting. He says there's a practically complete consensus in Russia on dealing with external threats, but he does note that the communists want to nationalise many assets, but his party's preference is to follow market principles, that he respects left-wing views, but then he comments in relationship to religion that there are 4 traditional religions in Russia, all exclusively patriotic, that he doesn't have a preference, if you like, for one of those religions. And he comments that they, as in those religions, are in this country in a much freer position than in many states that consider themselves democratic. We never exert any pressure on them. We believe we are in debt to them because during the Soviet years their property was squandered or taken abroad and sold and so on. The next question, which I think is number 5 maybe, the 5th questioner, is from Kubat Rakimov from the Kyrgyz Republic. And he is a former advisor to the Prime Minister of the Kyrgyz Republic, or Kyrgyzstan, and chair of their Chamber of Commerce. He asks, how can the experts gathered together at Valdai help promote social justice and support Russia as a leader of a new anti-colonial movement? Quite an interesting question. And then he perhaps more cheekily asks, how would Vladimir Putin consider relocating the capital of Russia, Moscow, closer to the other Shanghai Cooperation Organization countries? Putin comments that Russia is a social welfare state and national development objectives address social goals. He comments that Moscow is on a better path now with its transport and social structure infrastructure development. And as a person who visited Moscow within the last couple of years, it's a fabulously well-organised city. And there is some action dealing with excessive centralisation of federal organisations, some companies moving to HQs into Siberia. And in effect, it's a not dissimilar response you'd get from any national leader. There's always a few concerns about over-centralisation in most states. The next question is from Ivan Timofeyev, who's a leading intellectual in Russia, involved in the Valdai Club, involved in comparative politics, Russian international affairs, and significantly involved in supporting the sort of diplomacy and foreign ministry efforts of Russia. He's, I guess, be a familiar figure in many sorts of countries, that kind of role. And he asked, given the resilience to the sanctions campaign and the extreme foreign policy conditions and all the sanctions, is it time to further deregulate the economy? And here Putin's response is pretty quickly, yes, we'll continue to reduce regulatory burden. But the most interesting aspect of his question is his kind of assessment of how Russia has responded to the sanctions campaign and the economic war against Russia. And he says, you're correct. In response to all the restrictions that are imposed on Russia and its economy, you said they, as in the West, expected our economy to crash. This was not just expected, a goal was set to crush the Russian economy, but they could not achieve it. Yes, you are right. Our economy has indeed become much more adaptive and flexible. It became clear that our businesses were already mature enough to replace imports and to take on the activities of the companies that left, our partners that decided to leave Russia. Our businesses easily took over and led the companies that had seemed only recently to be unable to exist without a Western presence. This was an easy change in most areas. Yes, we understand and see the difficulties in the medium term. We realise that we cannot produce everything. But this morning I talked with several colleagues before coming here. Naturally, I talked with people in the government, the central bank and the executive office. And our experts still believe that we have passed the peak of the difficulties linked with the avalanche of restrictions and sanctions. Overall, the Russian economy has adapted to the new conditions. I did do a podcast a while ago on the question of who miscalculated most in the Russia-Ukraine war. Was it Russia in invading Ukraine, or was it the West in launching a full-out economic war which has created enormous blowback in their own economies without the desired effect of crashing the Russian economy? Okay, the next question, I think it's question 7, from Alexander Prokhanov, who is a writer, political figure and public personality and editor-in-chief of the Zavtra newspaper in Russia. And he says, very often foreigners ask us, what can you Russians offer to the modern world? Where are your Nobel Prizes? Should we make the current Russian ideology a religion of justice? And Putin jokes a little bit in response and says, well, we've already got 4 traditional religions. I think that's enough. We don't need 5. But then he comments that Russia does not need to offer anything to the world. We are working to strengthen our sovereignty, and it will lay the foundation for our future growth, technological, educational and scientific growth. And he has a little scoff at both Obama's Nobel Prize, but also comments that the United States' apparent research leadership role in research, science and technology is a little bit vulnerable and perhaps even a little bit illusory, reliant on its dominant financial position. Clearly, the United States, with its competitive edge as a global finance monopolist, is pumping out like a vacuum cleaner everything from all over the world, including researchers and creative people. I think it probably means sucking up like a vacuum cleaner rather than pumping out. That's probably just a translation issue. This too will come to an end when the dollar loses its monopoly as a global currency, something we see happening today. again, it picks up that incredibly important theme of the likelihood of a significant change in global financial currency and payment systems in the next couple of years. The next question is from Ruslan Rumazov, who's from Rosatom, which is the Russian State Atomic Energy Corporation, who is actually a specialist in quantum technologies, quantum computers and things. And his question, again, is kind of interesting. It's a whole different perspective on the world. He says the most powerful quantum computer today is in China, not the USA. And so with the range of threats to Russian sovereignty, should we plan longer-term research projects? Here, Putin comments that he comments on the very careful attention his friend Xi Jinping pays to these matters and agrees to long-term planning, plus ultimately the greater viability of building scientific careers at home where people are in touch with their culture rather than simply offering more money in America. And again, there's that interesting theme there about the seeing the multipolar world not just in geopolitical terms, but also seeing the multipolar world develop in terms of multiple other sources of leadership and creativity and scientific advance, etc., in terms of technology, computing, other sorts of things. Everything, we don't all just look to Washington and Silicon Valley anymore. The next question is from Wang Wen, a professor from the Chongyang Institute, Renmin University of China. He asked, do you feel under pressure? Do you afraid? And what do you want to say to Chinese people? And your comments on the past 10 years of Russia-China relationship. And Putin says, well, I'm not afraid. I have to do my duty. And he comments again that he's a close friend of Xi Jinping and that there's increasing trade volumes between China and Russia, and that Russia will always treat China with respect as a friend. Then Professor Mohammed Ihsan from the Kurdistan region of Iraq asked a question. He's got a PhD in international law and is an investigator of genocide crimes, a former Minister of Extra-Regional Affairs in Iraq, and asks about the Kurds in Kurdistan and how they can strive for better security and justice in the world. And Putin's answer basically says we should strive for a balance of interests so peace can be sustainable. And this is an interesting term. I kind of looked it up, and there's an Australian Indian academic who was a former senior official in the United Nations under Kofi Annan, a man called Ramesh Thakur, who sort of outlines the concept of balance of interest, saying that it is a better analytical concept and policy precept than the national interests. Look, I might even do a separate podcast on that whole concept. It's quite an interesting thing. What does this idea of the balance of interests mean? And is the American focus in particular on the national interest or the imperial national interest leading the world astray? Next question is from Konstantin Staris, who's an opposition figure in the Republic of Moldova. And he asks about the development of a single economic, humanitarian and cultural space that would stretch from Vladivostok to Lisbon, which in fact was an earlier proposal voiced by Vladimir Putin in the early days of his presidency in 2001. Is it possible to build a world without a hegemon, a global policeman or a dominant power? And Putin comments, why not? But first of all, Europe has to regain its legal capacity. And here he refers to Helmut Kohl, former Chancellor of Germany, when he was Chancellor of West Germany when the Berlin Wall fell, and then he sort of navigated the process of the unification of Germany in close dialogue with Mikhail Gorbachev. And he comments that Helmut Kohl once remarked that for Europe to keep global, it had to work with Russia. So again, Putin is flagging, we can work with you, but you have to decide to work with us as well. The next question is from Connie Rahagundi Bakri from Indonesia. She's the Executive Director of the Defence and Security Studies Institute in Indonesia, and works in particular on how China and Indonesia can work together on sea power, which is an interesting point and one perhaps the Australian government might want to pay more attention to. And she asked, do you think you and China, that is in Russia and China, could file this issue? I'm not quite sure what she was referring to there. I think it's about the development of blocks to wipe out NATO AUKUS, the Australian, UK, United States security arrangement, the Quad, the five power defence arrangements, everything about it together. Is that possible? And Putin comments, President Widodo of Indonesia calls me brother. That block thinking is a bad idea and is having negative consequences for the US allies, including he makes references to the Australian nuclear submarine program. A real own goal from Australia there. The next question is, I think, question 13. It's from Major General B.K. Sharma of India. He's a former director of the United Service Institute of India, its leading sort of kind of military think tank. And he asks, what role do you see for India in this emerging multipolar world? Putin says it will be a very big role, and he comments that Prime Minister Modi is one of the few people in the world who are capable of pursuing an independent foreign policy in the interests of his people, despite any attempts to contain or restrict something. He's like an icebreaker, just moving calmly in the direction that the Indian state needs. The next question is from Igor Galiv from Brazil. It's sort of asked in his absence. And it's about the role of Brazil and the BRICS. And here Putin comments particularly about Saudi Arabia deserving to be part of large international organisations such as the BRICS or the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. And the comments that a short time ago we agreed on Saudi Arabia's status within the SCO, and we will continue to strengthen our relations both bilaterally and as part of multilateral associations. And if Saudi Arabia does join the BRICS, as it's been reported is on the cards, that is a huge shift, because again the American dollar is very dependent upon the trade of Saudi oil in American dollars, or the settlement for Saudi oil being in American dollars. So a growing integration of Saudi Arabia in the sort of Eurasian economic zone will further weaken the Atlanticists. Mohammed Attar Javed asked a question from Pakistan. He's the Director General of the Pakistan House International think tank. And he asked about the hate syndrome at the moment that seems to be directed towards Russians and its similarities to racist totalitarian movements in the 20th century. And here Putin comments that there is certainly some of that ethno-nationalist ideology present in Ukraine, but he also comments that the Ukrainian government and the Americans in support of the Ukrainian government are manipulating people to some degree. Flag wavers in Ukraine are manipulating people with these nationalist ideas, but are driven by more selfish interests. They want to keep billions of dollars they stole from the Ukrainian people in Western banks. They stole it, hid it in Western banks, and will do anything to protect their capital, anything the West tells them to do. Only they are putting it in a nationalist wrapper, presenting it to their own people as a fight for the interest of the Ukrainian people. If things don't turn out the way America and Ukraine want, and some of the true facts about what's been going on in Ukraine in recent years do come out, I think there will be a lot of people in the West who will have to have a good hard look at themselves. The next question is from Kim Hung Chong from South Korea. He's the president of the Korean Institute for International Economic Policy, a long-standing figure, and he asks about tensions with Taiwan and North Korea, including around the use of nuclear weapons and also climate change. So again, Putin's comments that it's crazy to compare Taiwan with Ukraine, and discourages provocations, expresses concerns about the supply of weapons from South Korea to Ukraine, destabilizing the situation, and comments that yes, we do need an energy transition from fossil fuels, but it needs to be orderly. And the part of the key problem at the moment is the West has disrupted energy markets with its sanctions. Then Lukyanov jumps in with a somewhat humorous question. He asks, did you tell Xi Jinping about the special military operation before you invaded Ukraine? Putin says, no, I didn't. The next question is from Nelson Wong, who is the head of a Chinese think tank, the Shanghai Center for RIMPAC. And he asks, what would you think would be the most important thing to establish in setting up a new set of rules for the multipolar world? And he comments again, the UN Charter is the basis of it. An end to the trade war against China is part of it. And there is a need for fair and open consensus, explicitly agreed rules that again preserve what he describes as a balance of interests. I think I'll do that video on what that term means. Then there's a question from Alexei Zermant from Belarus, asking about would you agree that with Asia and the East in general making strides in economic growth, we need not only to develop the material infrastructure, but also focus on the cultural and humanitarian aspects so that our ideas, values, and outlook on the world overlap with the ideas and values in the countries of the East? Putin comments, Russia is a Eurasian country. We have largely reoriented our cooperation to the Asian countries. China and India are the cradles of world civilizations, and we approach this with great respect, attention and interest. The Russian public's interest in these civilizations has always been very high. Again, turning away from Europe towards that symphony of plural civilizations. The next question is from Falani Mtembo from South Africa, who heads up an Institute for Global Dialogue that focuses on sustainable development, especially through African-Chinese cooperation. And he asks about regional cooperation in the multipolar world and the Russia-Africa Summit. And Putin comments that South Africa plays a really important role in the BRICS, and then comments again that Russia's support for African countries is broad, and it is not Russia that is taking the actions of money printing, financial monopoly, and economic sanctions that are having a terrible impact on African countries now, including in food markets and inflation. The people taking those moves, of course, are the West. And again, he refers to the fundamental issue being to strike a balance of interests in regional cooperation and institutions of the multipolar world. Then there's a question from, and this is question 21 maybe, getting close to the end, maybe 20. Dimitris Konstantakopoulos, who's a former advisor to the Greek Prime Minister Papandreou and is a journalist. And he asks about the integration of the ex-Soviet Union space and what words would Vladimir Putin offer to citizens of the West. And Putin comments in relationship to the integration of the sort of Eurasian sort of space, that it's important not to rush things and make the mistakes of the European Union, integrating countries at very different levels of economic development, something people would be very aware of in Greece, I guess. And then to the Western citizen, he says, somewhat cheekily, the first thing he'd say is to campaign for higher wages. Lukyanov jumps in and says, does that advice also apply to the Russian citizens? And he says yes. So next wage campaign, if you're listening to this from a Western country, you have Vladimir Putin's backing for your wage claim. And then perhaps more seriously, he also says, don't believe Russia is your enemy or opponent. It's just not true. Don't be a conscript in the information war against Russia. Then there's a question from Natalia Zaitsa, who's from Russia but involved in the African Business Initiative Union, and she asks about what his vision of a new international partnership institution is, and he really basically just outlines three interests: that it needs to be based on sovereignty of nations, genuine sovereignty of nations, that it needs to be based on genuine consensus amongst those open and explicitly agreed consensus based on international law of those sovereign nations, and that it needs to strike, again, that term, balance of interests. Alan Friedman from Canada asks, what can we do to build relations between those in the collective West who are fighting what their governments are trying to do and the support that exists in the global South and in Russia for Russia's courageous actions and position in world politics? And Putin says, follow your national interests and we will work in harmony with you. And then there's a question from Gabor Stier, who is a foreign policy journalist at the Hungarian conservative daily, the Magyar Nemzet. He asks a somewhat cheeky question. Perhaps this is he is a journalist after all. This is a little bit of a trap question. He asks, should I go to visit Odessa in Ukraine? That some people have speculated Russia will want to sort of reclaim as a Russian city. And if I go to Odessa for a holiday, should I apply for a Russian or a Ukrainian visa? And a skillful politician that he is, Vladimir Putin, avoids that question about the visa and just comments that yes, Odessa is a beautiful city, but when he last visited it under Ukrainian administration, its public utilities were in disarray. And then the final question is from Carlos Ron, who is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs for North America and President of the Simon Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples from Venezuela. And he asks about Russia's response to does Russia's response to the economic war against it, to the range of sanctions, illegal sanctions placed against it, does it offer a model to other countries around the world who have had, such as Venezuela, who have had sanctions placed against it? And Putin comments, yes, Russia is creating a space of freedom through its successful efforts countering the economic blitzkrieg of the West. So there you go. That is 4.5 hours in 45 minutes. And the big takeaway I would draw out of that is how much the world is actually open to dialogue about the multipolar world and the symphony of civilizations as outlined by Vladimir Putin. In fact, there's a great piece that's or sort of a little short report that's been prepared by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in the last couple of days that argues the Ukraine war has exposed the waning influence of the United States with the global South, this term that's used to describe, Africa, India, Latin America, etc., South America. And on my podcasts about Ukraine, the Burning Archive podcasts, and there'll be a link below, I argued way back in February that there are 4 axes of war between Russia and NATO. There's the military conflict, there's the information/culture war, all the various bans on Russian media, etc., the propaganda, and there's the economic war, or the sanctions, the attempts to crash the Russian economy. And finally, there is a diplomatic war, perhaps most clearly seen, at least in Australia, around the debate about what role should India play? Should India take sides, or should it remain neutral? And I'm going to repost those audio podcasts on my YouTube channel shortly. I think they've sort of stacked up the sort of 6 to 10 episodes I did on the Russia-Ukraine war earlier in the year until things got a little bit hot in terms of the information war. But I think maybe the evidence of Vladimir Putin's Q&A session, the evidence from this report from the Quincy Institute is that the West, or the Atlanticists, are indeed losing the diplomatic war. And I think I might do another video soon, both on that concept of balance of interests, but also on the Quincy Institute's proposals for how the West can pursue a different kind of diplomatic campaign to get the rest of the world on side if it's not already too late. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick rundown or fairly comprehensive rundown, I guess, of Vladimir Putin's session. Good on you for being curious about it. I hope I've been able to educate you a little bit. I've certainly learned a bit in just preparing these videos, a lot more about the outlook of Vladimir Putin, Russians, and indeed across a large part of the multipolar world and their perspectives on what are the important issues and how things are developing. So there'll be more from me soon. On the Burning Archive, you can also check out my audio podcast, the Burning Archive podcast. It's on all the podcast platforms, and I'm loading up a few more on the YouTube channel. You can check me on Twitter at Archive Burning, and my website, theburningarchive.com, and my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Do like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.